The Zimmer Insurgency. A novel by Jason Shannon. This is the author. 17 April 2165. Devenot, Quebec. Republic of Panamerica. 11:15 Zulu. It was an unusually brisk morning in the small town of Devenot, in the north of the state of Quebec. Kayla stared emptily out the dusty window and slowly watched the sunrise. Today was her 28th birthday, and yet it felt as though her forehead should carry a dozen wrinkles, and the black hair that fell over her face should be long gray. She watched the mail courier walk up the long driveway from the pockmarked country road. He was already wearing shorts. It was too chilly for her, though, on this cool April morning. She answered the door, signed for the package. A chill went up her robe. She gave a thumbprint on his pad. That thumbprint had cost her a lot. The box was small. Inside was a single bottle of pills. She heard the shower shut off. Her husband walked briskly into the kitchen wearing nothing more than a towel. She didn't hide the pills in her hand. He gave her a nice affectionate smack on the ass, grunted quietly at the pills, and opened the refrigerator to drink goat's milk straight from the carton. She'd almost come to like those good morning spanks. It meant he was in a good mood. "You sure those pills are working?" he asked, looking through the fridge for nothing in particular. He still thought they were fertility pills. "Conception is really difficult for women in my family," she repeated again, almost methodically. She smiled thinly at him. "We're a dying breed, us." He grunted again. A buzzer dinged on the refrigerator. "That damn tiger's back," he said, half excited. He was in the next room before she knew it, and then out the back door wearing just a pair of overalls and with a rifle in his hand. It could be treacherous living all the way up here in the north of Quebec. After the cloning initiatives to reintroduce extinct fauna to the world, some of the larger animals retreated into new wildernesses that they had never known before. One particular Tasmanian tiger kept hounding this western area of Devenot. She wasn't so much afraid of Tassie tigers, though. She'd known worse beasts in her time. She opened the pill bottle. It was still sealed with the little tin-foil safety seal. She gripped the flap and pulled it up. Inside was the usual bottle of concealed contraceptive, and nothing else. Her heart fell for a second, and then she looked to the safety seal. It was double-layered, and she unfolded it to find the new fingerprints, good for the day most likely, and a small message above the print pad. "I hope you're ready." Was she ready? She'd spent years working on this. Trips to South America, dead drop packages from Aussie and Chinese intelligence, new fingerprints, cheekbones, and breast implants. Nightmares her husband would never pick up on. This was her baby, her plan, her... What would they even call it? An insurrection? A sedition? A rebellion? A revolution? What would the history books say? What would President de Mendoza label it? What would his lackeys in tinfoil hats? But if one thing went wrong... She went about her normal wifely duties. Nothing could be out of place. The mailman couldn't notice anything askew. The neighbors couldn't have any raised eyebrows. The Jehovah's Witnesses couldn't catch anything out of the ordinary. Not until her part in this began. She needed to be a good wife. Shots rang out in the distance behind the house. Her husband had terrible aim, and she doubted he'd come within a mile of it. He wasn't supposed to be firing a gun off within the municipal limits like this, but out in unincorporated Deveno, no one minded a hunting rifle going off. It was one of the reasons she liked it here, closer to Greenland than she was Toronto. Anonymity. Even if a neighbor complained, her husband would be given a stern talking to by a drunken local sheriff, and the report, if any, would never make it through the regional hoops to bounce between this branch of the military or another. Quebec City wouldn't red flag her with the illegals list, much less Panama. She'd seen it once, the tiger, the thylacine, half wolf, half tiger, and all Australian, out here on the wrong side of the planet. Tasmania was half underwater now, though. It had been off in the bushes one day, just standing there, sniffing around. She hadn't called for her husband. She hadn't been a good wife that day. It just seemed so misunderstood. Mary was out on the back porch, 3/4 of a mile or so away, peering into the ravine. The neighbor. She didn't like the rifle, Kayla could tell. She never said anything, though, because she grew a little marijuana in that garden of hers. Drunken sheriffs don't give you lectures for that. She'd shown up stoned to church every week, though there was a lot of substance abuse in this area. Back alleyways and illegal casino basements existed in Deveno. Kayla had stumbled into one day. Sting was everywhere. That pervasive psychedelic. The tainted milk. Zoned-out pot smokers, though illegal, weren't the primary concern of the drug squads. This far north, the sheriff was worried about Deveno getting the reputation of a pirate port. Sting and pirates went hand in hand, she knew. Kayla rather agreed with the sheriff on this one. Anti-piracy was federal jurisdiction, and she didn't want an FBI detachment from Panama out here any more than the sheriff did. She knew the sheriff rather well, though she could never quite get the French inflection right on his name. She spoke English, Spanish, and gutter Portuguese, but she couldn't master French for the life of her. The sheriff often attended her husband's bi-weekly poker games. Her husband would drag the kitchen table into the back room and invite over the sheriff, Mary's husband, a sallow, quiet man who always looked tired, and a few others from town. Fill the house with smoke and vent about the economy this far north. They would bet with cigarettes, just as illegal as those gold coins that floated through the underground casinos, but more forgivable when reports of tobacco came across the governor's desk. They gambled with cigarettes, like this whole town was a common prison. Maybe it was. Maybe this whole damned country was. The sheriff was one of those who strongly believed in the Western Skein, as it had become known. Panamerica's great grid of commerce. One day, they all hoped, every island from Greenland to Baffin to Ellesmere to Banks, and everything in between, all interconnected by maglev train lines. Just like the Pacific. But it was the Aussies that were the most impressive from space. Up above, it was said, you could see this great web of tendrils, spokes and fibers running between every state in the Pacific. The skein. They even had plaques labeling it that. Lines ran from Japan to New Zealand, Taiwan to Malaysia, the Philippines to Hawaii, Korea to Queensland. As many tracks as ran between New York and the ruins of Los Angeles, twice over, were scattered through the West Pacific. On a clear day, it could be seen from orbit. Or so they said. Kayla had never been to space. She had seen the skein, though, from the ground, that is, from inside. Years ago. And the Deveno sheriff was crazy enough to believe that one day they'd build the Western equivalent in the Canadian Arctic archipelago. A lot of people in this part of the world were. That was why her husband had come up. Ironwork on the maglev lines would be good money when it came in. That was why she came up here, to while away the time on the edge of the world where it would never be built. This is where she needed to be. Desolate northern Quebec, the edge of the world, but still in the country. In the country, internal, under the radar, but away, far away. Not in Bolivia, where she could set her watch to train bombings. Not in Atlanta, where the National Guard was camped out to prevent anarchists from starting dumpster fires. Not in Panama City, blocks away from the president and his lackeys. No, Panamerica already had a skein, though it didn't carry that name, and it was nowhere near as impressive as the Pacific. It was the Caribbean, stretching from Miami to Caracas, Honduras to Cuba, to Haiti. But not that one island. Kayla had been there, too, all those years ago. On the run. But in 24 hours' time, it wouldn't matter. It wouldn't matter what the sheriff rambled about as he gambled away illegal cigarettes. It wouldn't matter that her husband pissed away one more day waiting for oodles of cash from a job that would never come. It wouldn't matter if the governor himself attended their church and cast a curious glance at their neighbor's giant pupils. It wouldn't matter if that scurvy dog, Black Goat, sailed up the Hudson Strait with war galleys. In 24 hours' time, she wouldn't be here. Whether today succeeded, or one domino failed to fall, and she was dead or in a holding facility, she wouldn't be here. So pirates or the FBI or President de Mendoza himself could tear apart this very house and chase down that stoner down the way with police dogs for all she cared. She heard the rifle go off out back again, and smiled to herself. She looked again to the note she now had tucked away in her pocket. She was born ready. With any luck, that tiger would rip her husband's throat out so she wouldn't have to. Auckland, New Zealand. Pacific Union. 11:45 Zulu. Global insurgency. That's what it was, Stephen Hammond realized, for the first time since he'd become entangled with this debacle. A conspiracy at the highest level. Well, he didn't like the term conspiracy. It made him sound like he was plotting to steal the mail of that tinfoil hat-wearing lunatic in Panama City. Granted, they were plotting against the good general and his superiors, and it was being hashed out in secret, and they did occasionally meet in smoke-filled rooms, though it was usually opium smoke in a den somewhere. But they weren't controlling the banks or anything ridiculous like that. They didn't meet quarterly to pull the global strings and instigate wars for the hell of it. Stephen stared at satellite images of the forested mountainside of Isabela, the largest of the Galapagos Islands. In less than 24 hours, the Pan Americans would be launching their first shuttle from there to rendezvous with the RPS Destiny of the Skies, a massive colony ship in high orbit. Then, over the next couple weeks, more shuttles would launch, either from the Galapagos or various other remote islands annexed by Panamerica, Easter Island or the Aleutians, and fill the endless hallways of cryogenics chambers aboard the ship. From there, the Destiny would travel the 20 light-year journey to the star system of Gliese 876, where they would get the first-hand look at the collection of planets and moons orbiting the small red star. It had become affectionately known as the Scarlet System. Stephen zoomed in on the Pan American shuttle site. The shuttle itself was hidden somewhere not even satellites could see, yet he knew it was there. The lucky occupants were already gathered on the island, given free hotel accommodations in the town of Porto Villamil. A good portion of that population was military officials, along with geologists, climatologists, biologists, astronomers, and various other scientists who would study the New World upon arrival, while the rest of the colonists remained in cryosleep. There were also Christian missionaries aboard the shuttle that would spread the good word to the New World, on the off chance they found any sentient life there following a false god. The bulk of it, however, was the large civilian population who simply wanted a new home. Stephen couldn't blame them for that. Stephen was a Pacific intelligence agent. He was formerly a field agent, had fought the Muslim rebels in China during one of their Uyghur uprisings. He even made it as far as Titan during the period of anarchy. Anything but anarchy, he chanted to himself almost methodically. That chant was almost like the sign of the cross with Titanic vets. He retired to a desk after tweaking warlord politics out there in the deep of space. After what he'd seen out there, a desk was pretty inviting. Now he served as an analyst, sifting through satellite images and intelligence reports. Today, however, he was simply watching surveillance footage of the Galapagos, as were many intelligence agents all over the world. He sat in his cubicle, with his work exposed to everyone who passed by. Hidden in a minimized screen, however, was satellite surveillance of a small town in northern Quebec. An old friend was living out there, preparing to travel halfway across the hemisphere to get to where she was going. He hadn't seen Kayla in years, not since her brief stay in Tasmania. They'd called her a pirate, an anarchist, a Confucian insurrectionist, even a Fundi Muslim, which he thought especially laughable now. With her 8th grade education, she probably couldn't spell Muhammad's name right. Press statements from Panama were as plentiful as the dodos out on the front lawn. It was their glorious day of triumph, the Pan Americans. President de Mendoza, his legacy, what the history books would record. Not if this conspiracy went through, though. If Kayla had her way, de Mendoza would be remembered in a much different way. He had to stop with if. Today needed certainty, needed blind faith that his cohorts were working in tandem, as faithful as he was. Zhuang didn't have doubt. Kayla certainly didn't. Not if she went back to Panamerica after what they'd done to her. He sighed, spinning around in his chair. In the next few hours, an international crisis would emerge, and he would be called into action. When that happened, he'd never see any of this again. He made a mental note to have lunch outside today, and feed the dodos some breadcrumbs from his sandwich. Xinjiang Province, Xiao Dynasty, 1225 Zulu. Zhuangzi was still on his mandatory morning sabbatical following his father's death. Though, in truth, he did little mourning, and with the demands of the 22nd century, the ancient Confucian practice had more become a gold standard to aim for than a mandatory mourning period. He spent at least a day every week in Tianjin reading reports from Counterfeiting Division. But now he was deep in the wilderness, in the heart of Xinjiang, the Muslim province of the dynasty. 3 of the 4 rebellions suffered during the history of the Xiao had been Islamic uprisings from this province, one making it as far as Rangoon and claiming excess of 5 million to plague and famine. But Zhuang himself was half Uyghur, so he never got the rude looks when he took the maglev to the end of the line in Urumqi. He didn't stay long in Urumqi. He rented a Mongol horse and escaped into the wild as soon as he could. He would tell his superiors in Tianjin he was seeking solitude to mourn his father. He wasn't, though. He had barely spoken to his father after what had happened with his sister. He headed straight for the border. The 20-foot fence was rusting in places, and at points had been torn down by Muslims looking to get into, or out of, the failed Kazakh state to the north. But where Zhuang was headed, the fence was pristine and rigid with electric sensors. Ignatova was already waiting for him on the other side. Zhuang dismounted his horse and approached the fence. Both were careful not to touch it. The sensors would set off alarms in both the Forbidden City and the office of the Premier in Samarkand. They merely spoke through it. "Is the fingerprint in the latest contraceptives?" Sergei asked. He spoke Mandarin, but he had a thick accent. Zhuang would have thought that after the time he spent inside the xiao, he'd have had a better grasp of the language. He was as white as sour cream, but with reconfig these days, he could mask himself as Han without much effort at all. But the accent. The Russian accent was thick and obvious in most non-Slavic languages, none more so than Mandarin. He sounded like a stereotypical Russian bad guy from a British thriller film. How he ever survived undercover in Nanjing, Zhuang would never know. "Of course," Zhuang replied. He found himself looking at the Kazakh landscape behind Ignatova, remarking on how peaceful it seemed. Tall evergreens were everywhere on that side of the border. It was hard to believe that just a little further into Kazakh, the CPSF had Muslims under martial law, and had gone so far as to burn mosques and use entire neighborhoods for target practice. Yet here, he could hear every breath his horse took. "I included the poison as well. Only time will tell if she's got the balls to go through with it." "Do you think she does?" Sergei Ignatova was with the Continental Peace and Security Force himself, though Zhuang knew he didn't burn mosques or shoot up civilians. That was all Premier Petrova's doing, who demanded the crackdown on one of the failed states in the SA. Petrova was not helping the image of the Children of Lebanon, as they were called, by painting a global image that the moderate Muslims of the Lebanese Enlightenment could be just as vicious as the Fundis. Ignatova, however, was one of the minority of Russians that still held to the Orthodox Church, and had refused assignments in Khatar because of the violence that was being demanded of him. Zhuang could respect the Christians. They weren't all like that madman Feng. The Feng Rebellion, that was the fourth of the Xiao's rebellions. And the worst. Even now, it was openly debated if it would be the downfall of the Xiao. After all, the most esteemed emperor, may he live 1,000 years, ate and drank and fucked himself to death in the imperial harem after that. It was a great imperial shame that the emperor had been taken by opium and drink, while the madman Feng still lived, though his rebellion had been utterly extirpated. The late emperor's great legacy, may it echo through the ages for a myriad centuries, would be the agrarian red reforms and the Feng. Not a tough act to follow. And that bastard Feng still had his followers in Korea and Australia with that damn Church of the Taiping. Zhuang had seen the imperial plans to assassinate Feng. Even now they were being plotted, years after the madman fell into Aussie custody for his crimes against humanity. Zhuang strongly disagreed with assassination attempts. They wouldn't have time to perform death by 1,000 cuts inside Feng's Taiwanese prison compound before the Pacific authorities broke the whole thing up and declared it an international incident. But he was only counterfeiting bureau, not an assassin. But kind men like Sergei were what saved the Christian name. After all, their Christ had parroted Confucius when he spoke the Golden Rule 500 years after the Great Sage. A firing squad would be awaiting Ignatova if his involvement in this were to get out. Petrova would see to that. His more moderate, peace-loving Islam be damned. Then again, Zhuang's own fate could be far worse. The executioners of the Weizhong Guard still practiced death by 1,000 cuts, as both men knew from their clandestine involvement in the toppling of the Feng Rebellion. Almost Feng's entire court suffered such barbarism at the hands of the Weizhong. Zhuang had almost been posted to the Imperial Guard, but was lucky enough to get Chinese intelligence instead. He thanked his ancestors for that. He was a good Confucian, and power, necessary as it was, must be justified. The boy emperor had yet to learn that. The Weizhong Guard had yet to learn that.
"She's got too many people riding on this,"
said Zhuang.
"She won't cower away in the moment of truth."
He had to believe that, or else he'd wind up in a cell next to his sister, if Chinese intelligence didn't behead him first. They still had public beheadings outside the Forbidden City. "We shan't see each other again, good friend," Sergei said. Zhuang wished he could have shaken hands in the Western tradition. Instead, a bow sufficed.
You have your cyanide if anything goes wrong,
Zhuang said as a last thought as he turned for his horse. Of course. Panama City, Republic of Panamerica, 1330 Zulu. The president of Panamerica was one of the few people in the world who still drove an independent vehicle through city streets. After the Shanghai Accord and the banning of old fossil fuels, internal combustion engines were relegated to the sand drifts of the old United Zaire, or the Southern Waste. Reports were Petrova let the fumers run rampant east of the Caucasus. There were only a few solar cars in rural areas, but only the most important of people cluttered the walking streets in town. The streets along El Presidente's route had been cleared, and his motorcade raced through the largest city in the Western Hemisphere. President Octavio de Mendoza IV quietly read a newspaper over his ledger in the back of his limousine. Yet try as he might, he simply couldn't concentrate. Today was probably the most important day of his career, a day that would live on in the history books for millennia to come. Today, they were launching the Destiny of the Skies, the first ship bound for the moons of the Scarlet System, as it was called. Or rather, the first shuttle of the Destiny. He looked out the sunroof. It was probably above him now, 20,000 meters up. And, in a little over 10 hours, the first shuttle would be launching from a top-secret location in the Pacific. His limo proceeded into a tunnel, cutting off the view of the sky. He turned back to the news, in the hopes that he might be able to concentrate. Then he felt the vehicle start to slow. After a second, he realized where he was along his route and sighed. He was about to get some bad news. The limousine came to a stop, and he soon heard a knock on the glass. General Servano entered with the president's chief of staff, Eric Brown. The general sat down across from de Mendoza, while Brown took his place at the president's side. As the vehicle began moving again, de Mendoza folded up his ledger. "We're going to make history today, General," he said in an unenthused tone. "No, sir, our enemies are." "Who is it now?" the president asked apathetically. "Muslim fundamentalists in Bahrain? Militant Confucian monks? Penguins and waras massing in Antarctica?" Servano was one tinfoil hat away from a straitjacket. He was the most paranoid of all the neocons in El Presidente's administration. He found anti-Panamericanism in the bureaucratic bribery of Samarkand. If some Aussie makes a crack at Pan-American gall surrounding the launch, he'll have de Mendoza in a bunker beneath the presidential mansion. "Let me guess," the president mocked. "Pirates, right? Their little space dinghies are going to overwhelm the Air Force up there with the Destiny, eh? Tell me, have you figured out if Black Goat is named for his goatee or a pet goat yet?" The general went just the slightest shade of red, but those who didn't know him would never be able to tell. He had little tics that showed his embarrassment. Undeterred, he had set a ledger down in front of El Presidente, showing a blurry satellite image of a man's face. The image then split itself in half to show a mugshot. "This is Saint Trevnia," he said, not bothering to enunciate. He butchered the name, even de Mendoza could tell that. "We believe he was born in Kamchatka Island to a Chinese mother and a Russian father. He enlisted in the Russian military under a fake name at the age of 16, he continued. Since then he's popped up in every conflict throughout recent history, including Pake's revolution on Mars and the period of anarchy on Titan. None of the three of them chanted the phrase, anything but anarchy. But then again, not one of them had been within a year's journey of Saturn. The Russians and the association had nothing to do with Pake, de Mendoza said. Titan was another story. The association was there, though it was mostly Arabian troops. Samarkand had very little to say about what went on up there. It was mostly regional governors, who wouldn't have any command over the Russian military on Earth. He defected from the Russian military after a year and a half, sir, Brown replied. He's a mercenary, Servano explained. Soldier of fortune. He looked back to his file. He speaks 13 languages at least, including Russian, Mandarin, English, Spanish, Portuguese. I get to the point, de Mendoza nodded. He's cropped up either as a novice recruit or an auxiliary soldier for MI6, Chinese intelligence, Antarctica Security Agency, Continental Peace and Security Force. Okay, well, what do we need to worry about this mercenary for? De Mendoza retorted. Do you know who Black April is? Servano asked. I know what Black April is, de Mendoza replied. Everyone knew what Black April was. It was a dark time in Pan American history. Granted, it happened before the Panamerican Revolution, yet it was their history nonetheless. Even to this day, Pan Americans had no interest in extending the southern border because the ruins of Paraguay stand at the gates. And everyone remembers Paraguay for burning the economy to cinders. Black April wasn't just a coup that led to the Shanghai, sir, Brown explained. After the collapse of southern South America, millions of people died. Those who survived resorted to living off the land or pillaging from former cities. They organized themselves into communes or gangs, cartels. One gang in particular called themselves Black April, Servano added. They're a rebel guerrilla group who blamed the North for their circumstances. They're believed to be responsible for numerous train bombings in the southern states. They won't be happy until we're gone from the map. And they're planning a disruption for today, de Mendoza deduced. We believe they're planning to destroy the Destiny, Brown replied. Blow her out of the sky. That's impossible, El Presidente replied. He knew that there were going to be hitches today, but some anarchist gang in the southern waste blowing the Destiny of the sky? Impossible. Of course, the Chinese would like to undermine Pan-American hegemony, and the Aussies were always looking to set themselves up as a superpower. And there was a roster a mile long of fundy evildoers from Yemen to neo-Taliban uprisings in the Kazakh steppe. But South American guerrillas? Brazilian anarchists? Those llama fuckers might be pumping in tankers full of coke, and the Antarctic were known to buy old caches of guns from the ruins of Buenos Aires. But no mere cartel would have the ability to sabotage the Destiny. There's enough weaponry aboard to light up the night sky, said Servano. The weapon storage is nowhere near accessible by civilian hands, the president argued. He found himself remembering the reports of train bombings in the south. There was one just last month in... where was that? Bolivia? Did anyone die in that one? He couldn't remember. Besides, he said, everyone aboard the ship was approved by the highest authority. Hell, half of them came across my desk. Tetravnia can pick any lock you put on that storage, Brown argued back. And he knows how to work any explosive. Just whose side was Brown on here? He tended to yawn through most of Servano's inane ramblings at intel briefings. If he'd been won over... What kind of mercenary would go on a suicide mission? Servano said calmly, there's also the possibility that one of our competitors is assisting. The vehicle went silent. The wheels thumped over cracks in the pavement. Nobody wanted to talk about foreign intervention unless there was proof. And Servano did have a bad habit of pointing fingers at Seoul or Zurich for every little problem. Hell, the man was this close to blaming the Weijung Guard for his missing remote. Chatter has increased 1,000-fold since we announced the launch, Servano reasoned. We're ahead of schedule and ahead of the rest of the world. The Aussies aren't far behind. If they were bankrolling Black April... General, I don't even want to think about it unless you have some evidence to back this up, de Mendoza commanded. I know people are watching. Hell, we're watching them build theirs. It doesn't mean they're plotting against us. I will not have my presidency marked by a global war. Regardless of our competitors, Brown quickly cut in, Black April is proving to be a serious threat. Brown's still pushing it, even though Servano's basically implied the Brits have got snipers trained on this limo. Okay, de Mendoza said, taking a second look at the ledger. What you're telling me is that you suspect this Black April cartel of hiring Tetrevnia, and they're going to try and destroy the Destiny, is that correct? That is what we believe, sir, Servano replied. Let's step up security around the ship, he began. With all due respect, sir, Brown replied. Perhaps we should consider launching at a later date. Absolutely not, El Presidente retorted. How serious was this? Brown knew how important this launch was to the administration. He'd been there briefing the president on all aspects of cryogenics. Maybe he needed to do something about these guerrillas and the Russian mercenary, but postponing was out of the question. We're going to make history today. We need to find this mercenary and deal with him. Don't worry about him, sir, Servano replied. We've got someone at Homeland Security. Brown was shaking his head. De Mendoza didn't even need to hear it. Servano had one of his assets. The assassins Sol and Samarkand knew about, but Panama denied fervently. De Mendoza didn't particularly like them because of the political bullshit they sometimes caused, but those incidents were few and far between, and a good bluff usually handled things. Like Petrova didn't have secret agents off the books, or the damned Weijung Guard. Maybe one of Servano's men was just what these guerrillas needed. She's very... Servano chose his words carefully. Qualified. Tetrevnia has been spotted around the Mediterranean. 2 partial body scans, Athens and Milan, in the past 18 hours. But our primary concern should be Black April, Brown quickly added. Reposition the Navy, de Mendoza ordered. Make sure the Galapagos are well protected. Aye, sir, Servano grinned. I want hourly updates, the president decreed. The general nodded. Sir, he asked almost hesitantly. About the rules of engagement for our friend. Don't do it, sir, Brown interrupted. El Presidente snapped his attention back to his chief of staff. First he's on board for action, now he's not? Reposition the Navy, yes, Brown agreed. Maybe even send in an asset. Maybe. He waved his hands downward in a slowing gesture to show his hesitance. But strict rules of engagement. We're talking untraceable poison, that sort of thing. Put a tiger in a cage and it isn't much of a predator, Servano quipped. I've seen the file on the one you want to send in. Purple Heart, Silver Star, a roster of illegal ops damn near 2 pages. Servano grinned. El Presidente said, Are we talking about... What was the expression with assassins? Quiet or noisy? Servano began sermonizing. On a historic day of the utmost importance. You know what that kind of time in low O2 on Mars can do to you? Enough, de Mendoza said. He tired easily of their banter. Servano, do what you will. Let me know as soon as Tetrevnia is dead. Brown's face fell. The limo came to a stop and let Servano out. The general quickly got into his own chauffeured vehicle, which had been tailing them. Brown lingered a minute in the limo's doorway. You realize what you've authorized him to do, don't you? Keep me informed, Eric, the president said impatiently. Brown stepped back and closed the door. The limo pulled away, leaving Brown alone in the street. As the president's limo rolled away, de Mendoza thought it strange that Brown liked to walk everywhere. He was always refusing rides. El Presidente shrugged it off. He tried to return to the news. This is Jason Shannon. What you've just listened to is the first 4 scenes of my novel, The Zimmer Insurgency. The Zimmer Insurgency was first published in 2013 and is finally being made as an audiobook. And as you can hear, I'm the one who's doing the voice acting. As of this recording, I'm about halfway through the manuscript, and I've set the date of June of 2023 for the release. The Zimmer Insurgency is a fast-paced science fiction political thriller. The entire Western Hemisphere is one continental banana republic. A former political prisoner has escaped from one of their black jails, and now she's plotting her revenge. Follow my social media for updates on the progress of the book, or you can stay tuned to places like Audible or my website. This program was produced by Jason Shannon. Music by Braden5702 via looperman.com. Text copyright 2013 by Jason Shannon. Production copyright 2022 by Jason Shannon. All rights reserved. No part of this recording may be played for an audience or reproduced in any form. It may not be streamed, downloaded, broadcast, or copied without prior written consent from the author. Address all inquiries to jm1shannon@gmail.com. Thank you for listening.